The mid-morning sun slanted through the cracked blinds of apartment 3B, casting tired light across Rachel Morgan's kitchen table. She'd been awake since 5, watching the brown water stain on the ceiling grow with each thunderous shower from the upstairs neighbor. The eviction notice, 48 hours, no extensions, sat beside a pile of unpaid bills, the red final notice stamps forming a pattern of defeat. Rachel's fingers traced the rim of her coffee mug, now cold and half empty, like everything else in her life. The ancient Honda in the parking lot hadn't started in 3 days. Her boss at Millbrook Diner had forgotten her paycheck again. And now the landlord, Mr. Gaines, had cornered her in the stairwell. Yesterday, his breath smelling of cigarettes and cheap bourbon. Pay by Friday or find somewhere else. His eyes had lingered too long on the curve of her neck, suggesting there might be other arrangements they could make. Rachel had hurried past, clutching her purse tighter, stomach churning. 8-year-old Sophie sat across the table, carefully spreading peanut butter on slightly stale bread, humming to herself. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail uniform, already on the collar, ironed crisp despite everything else falling apart around them. She was making her own lunch again. Too young to carry such responsibility, but too perceptive not to notice her mother's exhaustion. The phone rang, startling them both. An unknown number with a Manhattan area code. Rachel hesitated, then answered, expecting another collection agency. The voice on the other end was polished, professional. William Harrison, attorney at law, representing the estate of Edward Morgan. Rachel's uncle, her estranged uncle, her dead uncle, apparently. She barely remembered Uncle Edward, a stern face at a family funeral when she was 12, maybe. The man on the phone was explaining something about inheritance, about property in New Hampshire, about coming to his office to discuss the details. Rachel almost laughed. She had a double shift at the diner, no car, and exactly $27 to her name. But Harrison was insistent. This was important, life-changing potentially. The estate would cover her transportation costs to the city. Sophie looked up, peanut butter knife suspended midair, sensing the shift in her mother's energy. Rachel hung up, mind racing through the impossibilities. An inheritance from family that had disowned her years ago, when she'd chosen Mark, the aspiring musician with the charming smile and empty promises. The cab Harrison sent dropped them at a gleaming glass tower in Midtown. The elevator whisked them up 47 floors, Sophie's eyes wide as she pressed her face against the glass, watching the city shrink beneath them. The Harrison and Associates reception area smelled of leather and money, two scents that had become increasingly unfamiliar in Rachel's life. William Harrison stood as they entered his office, a tall man in his 60s with salt and pepper hair and glasses that probably cost more than Rachel's monthly rent. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced, but not unkind. The office windows overlooked Central Park, the early autumn trees just beginning to turn gold and crimson. Sophie settled into an oversized leather chair with a book from her backpack, while Harrison opened a thick folder on his desk. Rachel perched uncomfortably on the edge of her seat, hyper-aware of her waitress uniform beneath her only decent coat, the runs in her stockings hidden by tall boots she'd repaired with black nail polish. The explanation was surreal. Edward Morgan, her father's brother, had died 3 months ago. No wife, no children. And despite the family's legendary estrangement from Rachel after her unfortunate marriage decision, Edward had apparently kept tabs on her life from a distance. According to Harrison, Edward had respected her refusal to come crawling back to the family after Mark left, her determination to make it on her own. And so in what Harrison delicately suggested might be either genuine admiration or some final family joke, Edward Morgan had left Rachel his most problematic asset, Morgan Estate, a sprawling historic property in rural New Hampshire. The inheritance included the mansion, all its contents, and the surrounding 30 acres of land. Harrison slid photographs across the desk. A massive stone structure loomed among overgrown trees, part castle, part Victorian nightmare. Ivy and moss claimed the walls. Many windows were broken or boarded. It looked like something from a Gothic novel, beautiful in its decay, but utterly uninhabitable. Rachel laughed, then a short, sharp sound. Was this the punchline, leave the struggling single mother a crumbling money pit she couldn't possibly afford to maintain? Perfect, the family's final cruel joke. Harrison's expression remained neutral as he outlined the details. The property had been abandoned for nearly 40 years. Edward had purchased it from distant family members in the 1980s but never lived there. Annual taxes were modest due to some historic preservation classification, and those were covered by a small trust for the next 3 years. After that, Rachel would be responsible. She was about to refuse the inheritance outright when Harrison placed something else on the desk, a heavy brass key ornately decorated with what appeared to be a compass rose pattern on the handle. Uncle Edward had been quite specific, Harrison explained. The key, the estate, and whatever it contained all belonged to Rachel now. What about the rest of the family? The cousins who'd never missed an opportunity to remind Rachel of her poor choices, surely they'd received the valuable assets, the liquid investments. They'd been provided for elsewhere. Harrison confirmed his tone, suggesting they'd been provided for quite generously elsewhere. Rachel's portion was specifically the Morgan estate with all its problems and potential. That night, back in the apartment, with its leaking ceiling and thin walls, Rachel sat at the kitchen table staring at the heavy brass key. Sophie had finally fallen asleep, her math homework completed, despite the shouting match between the couple upstairs and the thudding bass from the apartment next door. The photographs Harrison had provided were spread before her. Despite the decay, there was undeniable grandeur to the place. Stone walls 3 feet thick, according to the documents. Craftsmanship from another era. Harrison had mentioned that Morgan Estate had been moved, literally stone by stone, from Scotland in the 1920s by her great-grandfather Gregory Morgan, nearly bankrupting the family in what local papers had called Morgan's Folly. A castle, an actual castle. Hers, but also a ruin, a money pit, a responsibility she couldn't possibly handle. The roof alone would cost more than she'd make in 5 years. The windows, the plumbing, the heating, if it even had heating. That was assuming the structure was sound, which seemed optimistic given the small trees growing from some of the towers in the photographs. The brass key caught the dim kitchen light, the compass, rose pattern gleaming. North, south, east, west. Directions to what Rachel traced the pattern with her fingertip, feeling something stir within her. Not hope exactly, more like curiosity. What had driven Edward to buy this place and then never visit it? What was hidden within those moss-covered walls? A sudden crash from the apartment upstairs made Rachel jump. Glass breaking, a woman crying, a man's angry shout. The same soundtrack that had played through the thin walls for months. Sophie stirred in the bedroom, whimpering in her sleep. The decision formed in Rachel's mind before she could talk herself out of it. They would go see this castle, just for a weekend, just to look. Maybe to laugh at Uncle Edward's final joke before signing the place over to the state or a historical society. Maybe to salvage something worth selling. Maybe just to breathe air that wasn't saturated with other people's misery. The following afternoon, while attempting to jumpstart the Honda with cables borrowed from her neighbor Rachel, made a discovery that sent a chill through her despite the warm September sun. Rifling through the glove compartment for the vehicle registration, her fingers brushed against a folded piece of paper tucked beneath the manual. It was yellowed with age, the creases worn thin from repeated folding and unfolding. A map fragment, hand-drawn in faded ink showing what appeared to be part of a building's floor plan. In the corner, barely visible, was the Morgan family crest, the same stylized M she'd noticed engraved on the brass key, and scrawled across the top in spidery handwriting, "North will guide the way." The paper felt electric in her hands as though charged with secrets. That evening, as Rachel packed a small bag for their weekend trip, Sophie sat cross-legged on her bed with colored pencils and a sketch pad. When Rachel came to check on her progress, she froze in the doorway. On the paper, rendered with surprising detail and perspective for an 8-year-old, was a stone mansion with asymmetrical towers and high-arched windows. A perfect match for Morgan Estate. "How did you know what it looks like?" Rachel's voice trembled slightly. "I never showed you the pictures." Sophie looked up, brown eyes wide and earnest. She didn't know. She dreamed about it last night. A big stone house waiting for them, and with secret rooms and hidden things. In the dream, they lived there, and they were happy. Before Rachel could process this unsettling revelation, her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered cautiously. A man's voice, deep and measured, spoke without introduction. "Don't go to Morgan Estate, Ms. Morgan. There are secrets that should remain buried." The line went dead before she could respond. Rachel stared at the phone, heart pounding. How did the caller know her plans? Who would care if she visited an abandoned property she now legally owned? The logical explanation was Harrison. Perhaps he'd shared the information with other family members who were unhappy with Edward's decision. But the warning carried an undercurrent of threat that left her unsettled. By morning, the unease had hardened into determination. If someone didn't want her going to Morgan Estate, that was all the more reason to go. The Honda miraculously started on the third try. They packed sandwiches, blankets, and Sophie's exploration kit, a flashlight notebook, and the disposable camera she'd gotten for her birthday. The school had granted Sophie a long weekend absence after Rachel explained the inheritance situation. The drive north took them through the changing landscape of early autumn New England. Concrete and glass gave way to rolling farmland, then to thickening forests blazing with fall colors. Sophie pressed her face against the window, counting red barns and horses, her excitement growing as civilization thinned. They stopped for gas at a small station in northern Massachusetts. While Sophie used the restroom, Rachel asked the elderly attendant about directions to Millbrook, New Hampshire. The man's weathered face changed at the mention, eyes narrowing slightly. Millbrook. Not much there anymore. What takes you that way? I inherited a property there. Morgan Estate. The gas station attendant's hand stilled on the register. The Morgan place, that old castle. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. They say it's cursed, you know. Strange deaths in that family. Always sudden, always unexplained. He made a subtle warding gesture, surprising in its superstition. I wouldn't spend the night there if I was you, miss. Rachel thanked him stiffly, paid for the cab, and hurried back to the car, trying to dismiss the encounter as small-town superstition. But the man's warning echoed the anonymous phone call too closely for comfort. The GPS signal grew spotty as they approached Millbrook, forcing Rachel to rely on Harrison's handwritten directions. The town itself was barely that, a handful of buildings clustered around a crossroads, most dating from the early 1900s. A general store, a small library, a cafe, a hardware shop. Time seemed to have forgotten this place, or perhaps deliberately bypassed it. They stopped at the cafe, a cozy space called the Mill House, with mismatched furniture and the comforting smell of coffee and fresh bread. The middle-aged woman behind the counter did a poor job of hiding her curiosity when Rachel mentioned they were heading to Morgan Estate. Like the gas station attendant, her expression shifted at the name. Nobody's been out to that place in 40 years, far as I know. We figured it would just collapse into the forest eventually. The woman wiped her hands on her apron, studying Rachel with newfound interest. You're a Morgan, then? Before Rachel could respond, a gravelly voice came from the corner of the cafe. You're Gregory's great-granddaughter. The Morgan eyes give you away. The speaker was an older man, perhaps in his mid-60s, solid and weathered like an oak. He sat alone with a newspaper and coffee, white hair, cropped short in a military style, his flannel shirt and work pants, suggesting a lifetime of manual labor. He folded his paper and approached, extending a calloused hand. Frank Miller. I helped build the East Wing extension back in '79, just after I got home from Vietnam. Your great-grandfather, Gregory, was an odd duck, but a genius in his way. Frank's eyes dropped to the brass key visible in Rachel's coat pocket. His eyebrows rose slightly. He gave you the key, did he? Edward finally passed it on. Rachel nodded strangely, reluctant to correct his assumption that she'd received the key directly from her uncle. Something in Frank's manner suggested he knew more about Morgan Estate than he was saying. Their conversation was interrupted when a white-haired woman entered the cafe carrying a stack of books. Dr. Eleanor Jenkins, the town librarian and local historian, as she promptly introduced herself upon overhearing their discussion. She was perhaps 70, with bright eyes behind cat-eye glasses and an energy that belied her age. Dr. Jenkins was visibly excited at meeting a Morgan. She'd been researching the family for years. She explained particularly their art collection, which had been quite impressive before the war. Gregory Morgan had connections with many European artists and collectors in the 1930s. Before Rachel could inquire further, Sophie tugged at her sleeve, eager to continue their journey. They thanked Frank and Dr. Jenkins, promising to return to town for supplies if they decided to stay overnight at the estate. The final approach to Morgan Estate took them along increasingly narrow roads until Harrison's directions instructed them to turn left at the lightning-struck oak. But they nearly missed it. An ancient tree split down the middle, its two halves reaching toward the sky like beseeching arms. Beyond it, a gravel road disappeared into dense forest. The rusted wrought iron gates hung partially open, one completely off its hinges. The Morgan crest, once proudly displayed at the center, was now barely visible beneath decades of corrosion. As they drove through, Rachel felt a distinct sensation of crossing a boundary, not just a physical one, but a threshold between her old life and whatever awaited them within. The driveway wound through thick forest for nearly a mile, branches scraping against the car like warning fingers. Sophie grew quiet, her earlier excitement tempered by the increasing gloom beneath the canopy. Just as Rachel began to wonder if they'd taken a wrong turn, the trees opened up and Morgan Estate revealed itself. Rachel's breath caught. The photographs hadn't captured its imposing presence. 3 stories of gray-brown stone rose before them, the asymmetrical design featuring multiple turrets and wings that seemed to have grown organically rather than been planned. Gothic revival windows, many broken or boarded, punctuated the facade like dark eyes. Ivy and moss claimed much of the exterior, nature slowly reclaiming what man had built. Despite decades of neglect, the underlying grandeur remained undeniable. This was no ordinary mansion. This was architecture, transported from another time, another continent. Stone gargoyles peered down from rain gutters, their features softened by weathering, but still recognizable as fantastical beasts. A massive arched entryway with double oak doors dominated the center of the main facade. "It's just like my drawing," Sophie whispered, eyes wide with wonder and apprehension. "Just like in my dream." Rachel parked in what had once been a circular driveway, now cracked and sprouting with weeds. As the Honda's engine died, the silence enveloped them. Not the empty silence of abandonment, but the living quiet of nature. Birds called from the surrounding trees. Wind whispered through broken windows. The estate seemed to breathe around them. They approached the entrance cautiously. The massive oak doors were reinforced with black iron bands built to withstand sieges in another century, another country. Rachel inserted the brass key into the lock, surprised when it turned smoothly, without the resistance she expected from decades of disuse. The door swung inward with a low groan that echoed through the entrance hall. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of light from holes in the roof and broken windows. The floor was stone scattered with debris and dead leaves. A grand staircase curved upward into shadow, its banister thick with cobwebs. The entrance hall alone was larger than their entire apartment, with ceilings that soared 20 feet high. Rachel called out a tentative hello, her voice echoing back mockingly. Sophie stuck close, one hand clutching her mother's jacket, the other already holding her flashlight, despite the afternoon sun providing adequate, if spotty, illumination through the broken windows. Beneath the grime and debris, Rachel could make out intricate stone carvings around doorways and fireplaces, hunting scenes, celestial maps, stylized gardens. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each detail rendered with painstaking care, now obscured by decades of neglect. They moved from room to room, finding a formal dining hall with a table long enough to seat 30, a music room with a dust-shrouded grand piano parlors, and sitting rooms furnished with sheet-covered pieces that suggested Victorian opulence. Most rooms were empty or sparsely furnished, but some still held furniture and decorations preserved beneath dusty sheets like ghosts of a bygone era. In what must have been the library, books lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Many were ruined by moisture and rodents, but some on higher shelves looked salvageable. Sophie ran her finger along the spines, leaving trails in the dust. The titles ranged from engineering and architecture to art history and mythology, many in languages Rachel didn't recognize. As they explored the second floor, Sophie discovered a child's bedroom that stopped them both in their tracks. Unlike the other rooms, this one seemed frozen in time. A 4-poster bed with faded blue curtains, shelves of antique toys, a rocking horse in the corner. Most unsettling was the collection of dolls arranged on a window seat, their glass eyes following movement, their porcelain faces cracked with age. "I know which room is ours," Sophie announced suddenly, leading Rachel down the hallway with surprising certainty. They entered a large bedroom with tall windows facing east, a massive fireplace, and an adjoining smaller room perfect for a child. How Sophie had known the layout was a question Rachel wasn't ready to contemplate. As the afternoon light began to fade, they made their way back downstairs. In the kitchen, Rachel found signs of more recent habitation. A newer-looking gas camping stove, some canned goods, and bottled water. Uncle Edward might never have stayed overnight, but someone had prepared the space for temporary use. Rachel was examining a drawer of surprisingly modern utensils when Sophie called from the butler's pantry. "Look, Mom, someone's been here." Not long ago. On the floor lay cigarette butts still smelling of tobacco and boot prints in the dust that were clearly recent. Rachel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty kitchen. They weren't alone, or at least others had been here very recently. Before she could suggest they leave, the sound of tires on gravel reached them through the broken kitchen window. A car was coming up the driveway, the distinct purr of an expensive engine, unlike her Honda's asthmatic rumble. Rachel pulled Sophie away from the window, instinctively moving toward the central hallway, where they could either retreat upstairs or exit through the main doors if necessary. Through a front window, she watched a sleek black Bentley pull up beside their weather-beaten Honda, the contrast almost comical. Three men emerged. The one from the driver's side wore an impeccably tailored suit, his silver hair contrasting with his tanned face. The other two men were younger, broader, with the watchful stillness of security personnel despite their business attire. The older man approached the entrance, the others flanking him slightly behind. Rachel hesitated, then stepped into the doorway before they could enter uninvited. Sophie remained partially hidden behind her, peering around at the strangers. The silver-haired man paused on the bottom step, surprise flickering across his features before his expression settled into a practiced smile. "Ms. Morgan, I presume. What a pleasure to finally meet you. I'm Maxwell Sinclair. I represent a development group with significant interest in historic properties like Morgan Estate." Rachel said nothing, one arm extended protectively to keep Sophie behind her. Sinclair continued smoothly, mounting another step. "I understand you've recently inherited this property. First, let me offer my condolences on your uncle's passing. Edward and I had several discussions about Morgan Estate over the years." That made Rachel find her voice. "You knew my Uncle Sinclair's smile didn't reach his eyes. We had mutual interests, though different perspectives on how to handle them." He gestured toward the crumbling facade. "May I come in? I have a proposition that might interest you." Against her better judgment, Rachel stepped aside. Sinclair entered alone, leaving his companions outside. He moved through the entrance hall with the confidence of someone familiar with the space, his expensive shoes leaving clear prints in the dust. Beautiful bones, this place. Terrible shame to see it in such disrepair. His gaze swept the grand staircase, the carved ceilings, the massive fireplace. Of course, the cost of proper restoration would be astronomical, millions at minimum. He turned to face Rachel directly. "I'm prepared to offer you $500,000 cash. No inspections, no questions. A clean transaction." Sophie gasped behind Rachel. Even Rachel felt her breath catch. $500,000, enough to change everything. A real house in a good school district, a college fund for Sophie, a life without choosing between rent and groceries. What the question escaped before Rachel could consider a more strategic response. "Why would anyone pay that much for this?" Sinclair's eyes narrowed slightly, though his smile remained fixed. "Let's say we're collectors of historical properties. Morgan Estate has quite a unique history." His gaze drifted to the second floor. "Quite unique indeed. What kind of history?" Something in his pause made Rachel's skin prickle with unease. "The kind worth preserving, or perhaps containing." Sinclair reached into his jacket and Rachel tensed involuntarily. He withdrew only a business card, offering it with manicured fingers. "My cell phone. Call any time, day or night." "But Ms. Morgan," he looked directly at her gray eyes, cold despite his smile. "Don't wait too long. Properties like this can be dangerous for those who don't understand their significance." The threat was implied but unmistakable. Rachel accepted the card without a word. As Sinclair moved toward the door, he paused beside a section of wall paneling, running his fingers along an edge, as though searching for something. Finding nothing, his expression hardened momentarily before the smooth mask returned. He nodded a curt goodbye and departed, his companions falling into step as he returned to the Bentley. Rachel and Sophie watched from the window as the black car disappeared down the driveway, its engine sound fading into the gathering dusk. "I don't like him," Sophie whispered, her small hand finding Rachel's. "He looks at the house like he wants to eat it." Rachel squeezed her daughter's hand in silent agreement, her mind racing. Sinclair's interest in his substantial offer confirmed one thing. Morgan Estate held value beyond its crumbling walls. But his warning lingered ominously. Properties like this can be dangerous for those who don't understand their significance. With darkness approaching and too many unsettling questions, Rachel decided they would return to town and find a motel for the night. They secured the main doors and drove back to Millbrook, the Honda's headlights cutting through the deepening twilight. The only accommodation in town was the Millbrook Inn, a Victorian building with 6 rooms for rent above a small restaurant. The innkeeper, a heavy-set woman named Doris, raised her eyebrows when Rachel mentioned Morgan Estate, but asked no questions as she handed over a key to a comfortable, if dated, room with 2 beds and a shared bathroom down the hall. Sophie fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the day's exploration. Rachel lay awake staring at the water stains on the ceiling. Different patterns than those in their apartment, but stains nonetheless. Her mind churned with possibilities. $500,000 would solve every immediate problem in their lives. But Sinclair's interest suggested the property might be worth far more. And then there was the unsettling feeling that she was missing something important. Something about the compass, rose on the key, the map fragment, Sophie's inexplicable knowledge of the estate's layout. Morning found Rachel at the town library before it officially opened, the business card for Harrison and Associates in hand as she used the payphone outside. While Sophie enjoyed breakfast at the inn, Rachel had decided to learn more about what exactly she had inherited. Dr. Jenkins arrived to open the library, delighted to find Rachel waiting. Inside the small building housed a surprisingly extensive local history collection. Jenkins led Rachel to a section dedicated to Millbrook's founding families, including the Morgans. The doctor's enthusiasm was infectious as she pulled out boxes of yellowed newspaper clippings and faded photographs. Morgan Estate hadn't been built by some eccentric millionaire, but transported stone by stone from Scotland in 1900. Gregory Morgan, Rachel's great-grandfather, had purchased a 16th-century castle near Edinburgh, one that was scheduled for demolition. He had it dismantled, each stone numbered, and shipped across the Atlantic to be rebuilt on his New Hampshire property. The newspapers called it Morgan's Folly, a monument to excess that had nearly bankrupted the family. The reconstruction had taken 7 years, with Gregory insisting on using traditional methods wherever possible. The local economy had boomed during the project, with dozens of European stonemasons and craftsmen living in Millbrook throughout the reconstruction. But the estate's history took a darker turn in the 1940s. During World War II, the property had been used by the government for unspecified research purposes related to the war effort. The articles were vague, mentioning only scientific research and matters of national security. Then abruptly in 1945, nothing, as if Morgan Estate had simply ceased to exist in public record. Your family owned that place until the 1980s, when your uncle bought it back. Dr. Jenkins explained, adjusting her glasses as she read over Rachel's shoulder. The government requisitioned it during the war. Quite mysterious about the whole thing. Rumors about art storage, code-breaking operations, even testing experimental radar technology. She closed the folder with a thoughtful expression. Families sometimes bury things they'd rather forget, especially rich families, especially during wartime. Rachel photocopied everything, her mind piecing together a strange narrative. A castle transported across an ocean. Government seizure during the war. Family deaths shrouded in mystery. And now Maxwell Sinclair offering $500,000 for ruins that had stood empty for decades. Back at the inn, she found Sophie in the small garden behind the building, sketching in her notebook. The drawings were unnervingly detailed. Floor plans of Morgan Estate, including rooms they hadn't entered, with doorways and windows placed with architectural precision. When Rachel asked how she knew these details, Sophie simply shrugged. It's like I remember it, but I know I've never been there before. It's weird, Mom, but not scary weird, more like finding something you lost a long time ago. Rachel called Harrison from the inn's phone, the photocopy pages spread before her on the bed. The castle, she said without preamble. What do you know about its history that you didn't tell me? Harrison sighed, the sound crackling through the connection. I was wondering when you'd ask. Your uncle was very specific. I was to tell you only if you inquired directly. Tell me what that Morgan Estate holds the answer to why the Brennan fortune disappeared. Your uncle spent 40 years trying to gain access to one particular room. He believed your great-grandfather hid something there before the government took control of the property. Rachel's heart quickened. The locked room. There must be a locked room they hadn't found yesterday. You found it. Harrison's voice sharpened with interest. Your uncle died believing he was the only one who knew of its existence. What's in it, nobody knows for certain. Gregory Morgan was many things. An inventor, an art collector, some say, a genius, others say mad. Before the government seized Thornfield, he claimed to have hidden his greatest treasure where only a true Morgan would think to look. Many have tried to find it. Your uncle bought the castle hoping to succeed where others failed, but he never even visited. No, he was afraid. Some of the family believed there was a curse, ridiculous of course, but your uncle was superstitious. He thought if he passed it to the right person. Why me? Rachel interrupted. He didn't even know me. Harrison was quiet for a moment. He knew more than you think. He knew you were raising a daughter alone. He knew you worked hard and never asked the family for anything, even when you had every right to. He said you were the only Morgan left who understood the value of perseverance. Rachel ended the call and sat watching Sophie sketch in her notebook, mind churning with new information. A locked room, a hidden treasure, a castle that the government had seized for mysterious wartime research. It sounded like something out of a movie, not her life. But the brass key in her pocket was real. The moss-covered castle was real. And Maxwell Sinclair's offer and warning were very real. That afternoon, Rachel made a decision that would have seemed insane a week ago. She called her boss at the diner and quit. She withdrew her meager savings account, all $1,243 of it, and paid 2 weeks at the Millbrook Inn up front. Then she enrolled Sophie in the local elementary school, explaining their situation to the principal as a family emergency requiring extended stay. "Where are we going?" Sophie asked, clutching her stuffed rabbit as they packed their few belongings into the Honda. "Home," Rachel said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "We're going home." They moved into Morgan Estate on a Tuesday afternoon. It sounds grander than it was. They set up camp in the one room where the roof didn't leak. The old kitchen with its massive fireplace became their base of operations, their sleeping bags looking absurd on the stone floor, like campers in a museum. The first night, every sound echoed. Wind whistled through broken windows. Somewhere in the walls, things scurried and scratched. Sophie crawled into Rachel's sleeping bag, and they lay there listening to their new home settling around them. "Are you sure about this?" Sophie whispered into the darkness. "No," Rachel admitted, stroking her daughter's hair. "But sometimes the best things happen when we're not sure." By morning, Rachel had a plan, or at least the beginning of one. She couldn't restore the whole castle. That would take millions she didn't have. But she could make parts of it livable. She could solve the mystery of the locked room. And maybe, just maybe, she could prove that Rachel Morgan, the single mom everyone had written off, was exactly where she was supposed to be. The first order of business was securing their immediate needs. Rachel drove into town and withdrew the remaining emergency fund from their old bank account via the local credit union. At the hardware store, she purchased basic tools, tarps for the leaking sections of roof, and supplies to board up broken windows. The cashier, a young man with curious eyes, mentioned that Frank Miller might be willing to help. He did odd jobs around town and knew Morgan Estate better than anyone. Rachel found Frank at his workshop behind the hardware store, surrounded by woodworking projects in various stages of completion. He didn't seem surprised by her request, merely nodding, as if he'd been expecting her. Within an hour, his pickup truck was loaded with additional supplies, and he followed her back to the estate. "I helped build the East Wing addition back in '79, Frank explained, as they worked to patch the kitchen roof. Gregory Morgan was particular about materials, said modern construction was garbage, wouldn't last a century. These walls, he ran a calloused hand along the stone, you don't see craftsmanship like this anymore. These walls will outlast us all." Word spread quickly in Millbrook. The single mother living in the castle. Some came to gawk, others to whisper. Rachel heard the murmurs at the general store, saw the sidelong glances when she enrolled Sophie in school. Morgan's Folly, they called it, just like the newspapers had a century ago. But Rachel and Sophie didn't care. They were too busy discovering their new home. Each day brought new revelations, secret passages connecting rooms, a dumbwaiter that still worked if you pulled hard enough, stone carvings hidden under centuries of grime. Faces, flower symbols Rachel didn't recognize. Sophie adapted with the resilience of childhood. She made friends at school despite being the castle girl, and her teacher reported she was thriving academically. Each afternoon, she'd rush home eager to explore another corner of the estate, her expedition notebook filling with drawings and observations. Frank became a regular presence, teaching Rachel basic carpentry and electrical work. She proved a quick study, surprising herself with her aptitude for practical skills she'd never had reason to develop in her previous life. Together, they made the kitchen and 2 bedrooms habitable with functioning electricity from updated wiring and water from a well on the property that Frank helped restore. Jenkins visited often, bringing books on art history and architecture, fascinated by the historical documents Rachel continued to discover throughout the mansion. They spent evenings by the fireplace piecing together the Morgan family history from letters and photographs found in trunks and drawers. Through these discoveries, Rachel learned more about her great-grandfather. Gregory Morgan had been an engineering prodigy with an obsessive passion for art and architecture. After making a fortune in railroad innovations, he devoted his life to collecting European art and artifacts, particularly during the turbulent years leading up to World War II. And always Rachel returned to that brass key with its compass rose pattern. She'd tried it in every lock they'd found, but many doors opened with regular keys Frank helped locate or replace. The ornate brass key remained a mystery, its purpose unclear. 3 weeks into their castle life, the intimidation began. First, it was just cars driving by slowly at night, headlights sweeping across their windows. Then Rachel found footprints in the mud outside circling the castle, suggesting someone had been looking for another entrance. She installed motion sensors, cheap ones from the hardware store, but better than nothing. Frank added deadbolts to the exterior doors and taught Rachel some basic self-defense moves from his military days. The second time Maxwell Sinclair appeared, he wasn't alone. 4 men accompanied him, all wearing suits that didn't quite hide the bulge of shoulder holsters. His Bentley pulled up the driveway late on a Friday afternoon as Rachel and Frank were replacing broken glass in the library windows. "Storms. Morgan," he said pleasantly, as if they were old friends meeting for tea. "How are you settling in?" Fine, Rachel replied tersely. Sophie was upstairs doing homework, and Rachel was grateful she couldn't see the hard-eyed men studying their home like they were memorizing every entrance. "I see you've begun renovations." Ambitious. Sinclair's gaze settled on Frank, recognition flickering in his eyes. Mr. Miller, still the castle's guardian. After all these years, Frank straightened, ladder creaking beneath his weight. "Some things are worth protecting, Sinclair. Some things should stay where they belong." Sinclair's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Indeed, that's precisely my position." He turned back to Rachel. "I thought I'd renew my offer. $1 million. More than generous for a property in this condition. Save yourself years of work and expense." Rachel crossed her arms, buying time to steady her going to bum. "Why do you want it so badly?" "Let's say I'm a history enthusiast. This castle has such fascinating stories. Like what? Oh, the usual. Bootlegging in the 20s. Those wartime experiments. Did you know they tested radar technology here?" Sinclair leaned in conspiratorially. "And of course, the legend of Gregory Morgan's hidden treasure. Though between us, I think that's just a fairy tale, don't you?" Rachel kept her face neutral. "Probably. Still, legends have a way of causing trouble. People get obsessive. They take risks." Sinclair's eyes hardened, though his tone remained conversational. "Sometimes people get hurt, especially single mothers with no one to protect them. Is that a threat?" "Advice, Miss Morgan, from someone who's seen how these situations can escalate. Take the money. Start fresh somewhere safe. Somewhere else." After they left, Rachel sat on the kitchen floor shaking. $1 million. Safety for Sophie. A life without looking over her shoulder. But then she remembered Harrison's words about her uncle, the only Morgan left who understood the value of perseverance. That night, Rachel dreamed about the markings on the locked door, a door they still hadn't found. In the dream, the compass rose on the brass key, aligned with identical markings on a hidden lock. She woke with a gasp, heart pounding. The next morning, Rachel and Frank conducted a methodical search of the main floor, looking for anything they might have missed. In the library, Rachel noticed something odd about a large tapestry depicting a hunting scene. Unlike the other wall hangings, this one was mounted on a wooden frame that extended several inches from the wall. When they removed it, they discovered a small door barely 5 feet tall with a modern lock installed, completely incongruous with the historical hardware throughout the rest of the castle. This was no original feature. Someone had added this lock recently. Frank examined it closely, whistling softly. High security mechanism. Not your standard hardware store deadbolt. Looks military grade, actually. He glanced at Rachel. Your uncle must have installed this, but why put a modern lock on an old door? Rachel tried every key they'd found throughout the estate, but none fit. Frank even attempted to pick the lock without success. The door remained stubbornly sealed, its contents a mystery. That evening, Dr. Jenkins joined them for dinner in the kitchen, excited by their discovery. The historian confirmed that Gregory Morgan had been obsessed with security and puzzles, often creating elaborate mechanisms to protect his valuables. He was quite the mechanical genius, she explained, warming her hands by the fire. Designed his own locks and safes. During the war, there were rumors he consulted on security systems for military installations. Sophie, who had been quietly drawing at the table, suddenly looked up. Like a puzzle box, my friend Zach has one where you have to push hidden buttons in the right order to open it. Dr. Jenkins smiled at the child, exactly like that deer. Gregory Morgan loved puzzles and secret compartments. He believed valuable things should require effort to obtain. Later, after Sophie had gone to bed and Dr. Jenkins had departed, Rachel sat by the fireplace examining the brass key again. The compass rose pattern gleamed in the firelight, each cardinal direction marked with precision. North, southeast, west. The words from the map fragment echoed in her mind. North will guide the way. She turned the key over in her hands, feeling its weight, studying its craftsmanship. The handle was decorated with the Morgan family crest, the stylized M at its center, almost worn smooth. Rachel had assumed it was just decoration, but what if? She held the key closer to the fire's light, examining the base of the handle where it met the shaft. There, almost invisible, a tiny seam. Heart pounding, Rachel pressed the compass, rose and twisted. The handle separated from the shaft, revealing a smaller key hidden inside. Only a true Morgan would think to look, she whispered to herself. The next morning, Rachel stood before the locked door, Frank and Sophie behind her. The hidden key slid into the lock perfectly. Rachel aligned the compass points, north to north, and turned. The lock opened with a soft click that seemed to echo through time. The door swung inward, and stale air rushed out, carrying the scent of old paper and something else. Machine oil. Rachel stepped inside, flashlight beam sweeping across what lay beyond. It wasn't a room, it was a vault. Filing cabinets lined one wall, tables covered in documents, maps, and photographs, and in the center, under a dusty tarp, shapes that made her breath catch. She pulled back the tarp and nearly dropped the flashlight. Paintings, at least a dozen. Even in the harsh beam, she could see they were masterpieces. The colors, the brushwork. These weren't prints or copies, they were real. Frank let out a low whistle behind her. My God, is that a Monet? Rachel's hands shook as she moved to the filing cabinets. The first drawer contained certificates, provenance papers, authentication documents. Names jumped out. Monet Renoir, a small Rembrandt sketch. But it was the second drawer that made her sink to her knees. Government contracts, classified stamps, in page after page detailing Operation Safeguard, a World War II program where private collectors had hidden valuable artworks to prevent them from being seized by Nazis if America fell. Morgan Estate had been a secret repository, and Gregory Morgan hadn't just been hiding art. He'd been protecting it for museums, private collectors, even European families fleeing the war. The war had ended, and the art should have been returned. But according to Gregory's final entries, he'd discovered something disturbing. Several pieces in his care had been stolen by Nazis from Jewish families. The supposed owners claiming them after the war were collaborators, thieves trying to profit from tragedy. Gregory had refused to return those pieces. And when the government tried to force him, he'd hidden them where only a true Morgan would think to look. Rachel sat amidst the treasure, surrounded by art that museums would kill for, understanding finally why Sinclair wanted the castle so badly. Some of these paintings belonged to families destroyed in the Holocaust. Some belonged to museums. And some, according to Gregory's careful notes, belonged to no one anymore. Their entire families erased from existence. Sophie appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleepy eyes. Mom, what is this place? Rachel pulled her close, kissing her forehead. It's complicated, baby. Are we rich now? Rachel laughed, surprising herself. Maybe, but these aren't really ours. Our great-great-grandfather was protecting them for people. Some of those people are gone now, but that doesn't mean we get to keep them. So what do we do? The right thing, Rachel said, though she wasn't entirely sure what that was yet. As she continued examining documents by flashlight, Sophie curled up on her lap, occasionally asking questions. Rachel found letters from families thanking Gregory for protecting their heritage. Photographs of artwork being packed, hidden, saved. A whole secret history of preservation and resistance. By dawn, Rachel had formed a plan. First, she would call a lawyer, not Harrison, but someone who specialized in art repatriation. Then the FBI's art crime division. This wasn't just about her and Sophie anymore. This was about justice decades delayed. As the first light of morning filtered through the vault's small window, Rachel looked down at her sleeping daughter and then at the paintings surrounding them. Millions of dollars in lost art, each piece with its own tragic story. For the first time since inheriting Morgan Estate, she understood why her uncle had chosen her. Not because she was the family failure, but because she would do what was right, no matter how hard the path. The compass rose on the brass key caught the morning light, its cardinal points gleaming. North, south, east, west. Directions home. Directions toward justice. Directions toward a future Rachel could never have imagined a month ago, when all she had was $27 and an eviction notice. Outside, birds began their morning songs in the trees surrounding Morgan Estate. Inside, Rachel Morgan held her daughter close, surrounded by lost treasures, finally found ready to face whatever came next. Rachel woke at dawn with the weight of millions in stolen art pressing on her conscience. The FBI's art crime division wouldn't arrive until afternoon. 12 hours to guard a fortune in masterpieces that had already survived a world war and 70 years of secrecy. 12 hours during which Sinclair might return, this time with more than threats. Frank arrived just after breakfast, his pickup rattling up the driveway like artillery fire in the morning stillness. His weathered face creased with concern when Rachel described their discovery and her call to the authorities. "The feds, huh? They'll want to confiscate everything. Take all the credit, too." Frank's fingers drummed against the kitchen table, his military training evident in how his eyes periodically scanned the windows and doorways. "You're sure calling them was the right move?" Rachel gestured toward the vault, where Sophie was carefully sketching one of the Monets. "What else could I do? These paintings were stolen from families during the Holocaust. My great-grandfather protected them. I have to finish what he started." Frank nodded slowly, respect kindling in his eyes. Gregory would be proud. Not many would choose justice over fortune. While awaiting the FBI, Rachel returned to the local library to research the collection's history. Dr. Jenkins greeted her with barely contained excitement, already pulling boxes of yellowed newspaper clippings from the archives. The articles painted a picture of Millbrook's transformation during the late 1930s. Gregory Morgan had employed dozens of European refugees, not just as laborers for his estate, but as catalogers, conservators, and security personnel. Photographs showed distinguished-looking men and women in formal attire standing before Morgan Estate, their expressions solemn despite the grand backdrop. Many wore small pins identifying them as members of various European cultural institutions. The most intriguing clipping was dated December 1941, just days after Pearl Harbor. A classified government notice authorizing temporary acquisition of strategic private assets, with Morgan Estate specifically named. Dr. Jenkins tapped a fingerprint-smudged paragraph near the bottom. "This is where history goes silent. Operation Safeguard was classified for decades. Some records were declassified in the 90s, but many remained sealed." Jenkins reached for another folder, this one containing her personal research notes. "My theory was that Morgan Estate served as a repository for European art treasures during the war, a safe house for culture that might otherwise be destroyed or looted." Rachel leafed through Jenkins's meticulous notes. The historian had traced shipments, personnel assignments, and cryptic government communications. She'd been astonishingly close to the truth without having access to Gregory's vault. Jenkins leaned forward, voice dropping to a whisper despite the empty library. There were rumors that after the war, certain parties, influential families with questionable wartime activities, tried to claim artworks they had no right to. The story goes that Gregory Morgan refused to return pieces to anyone but their legitimate owners. And that's why he hid everything and locked it away. Rachel finished the puzzle pieces clicking into place. Jenkins nodded, her eyes bright behind cat-eye glasses. "I always wondered what happened to him. The official record says heart attack, 1947. But some locals whispered about foul play, government men in dark suits seen at the estate the week before. Then the family cleared out almost overnight. The estate stood empty until your uncle purchased it decades later." A chill crawled up Rachel's spine. The weight of history pressed down, suddenly personal. Not just paintings in a vault, but her family's legacy, bloodlines and secrets intertwined with world events. She thought of Sinclair's warning properties like this can be dangerous for those who don't understand their significance. When Rachel returned to the estate, she found Frank on the roof repairing loose tiles, maintaining a vigilant position with sightlines to the approaching driveway. Inside, Sophie was in the kitchen with an elderly woman Rachel didn't recognize. A tiny figure with silver hair twisted into a severe bun, stirring a pot of something aromatic on the stove Frank had recently connected to the propane tank. The woman turned, revealing a face mapped with deep wrinkles and sharp, intelligent eyes. Martha Klausner, she introduced herself, the accent still noticeably German, despite decades in America. I worked for your great-grandfather during the war. Frank found me this morning. Said you might need perspective. Rachel glanced questioningly at Sophie, who seemed perfectly at ease with the stranger. Mrs. Klausner makes the best stew, her daughter clarified, already set to work kneading dough for dumplings beside the elderly woman. As they prepared lunch together, Martha shared her history. She'd been 18 when she fled Germany in 1938, the daughter of a prominent Jewish art dealer in Berlin. Gregory Morgan had brought her family to Millbrook, providing them sanctuary when few others would. We weren't the only ones. Dozens of families passed through Morgan Estate. Some stayed, others moved on to New York or California. But Gregory gave everyone shelter and purpose. The estate became our fortress against the darkness spreading across Europe. Martha had worked as an assistant cataloger, helping document each artwork that arrived in secret shipments. After Pearl Harbor, when the government officially commandeered the estate, she'd stayed on as a translator and consultant. The real trouble began after the war ended. Martha continued, her gnarled fingers working the wooden spoon with surprising strength. Men came with papers claiming ownership of various pieces. Some claims were legitimate families who had survived and were trying to rebuild. Others, her mouth tightened into a thin line. Others were vultures, collaborators, people who had profited from Jewish suffering, now trying to claim the spoils. And Gregory refused to give them anything, Rachel prompted. Martha's eyes flashed with decades-old fire. He was magnificent in his fury. Told them he would rather burn the entire collection than return a single brushstroke to thieves. The government men didn't like that it created diplomatic complications. But Gregory held firm. The standoff continued for nearly 2 years. Then in 1947, Gregory Morgan died suddenly. Martha's voice dropped to a whisper. He wasn't sick, not even old, barely 60. But they said heart attack. And who could argue the family was frightened? They moved away. The art disappeared. Everyone assumed the government had finally seized it. But he'd hidden it, Rachel said, where only a true Morgan would think to look. Martha nodded, a sad smile creasing her face. He always said blood remembers what the mind forgets. I think he knew someday the right Morgan would come home. The arrival of the FBI transformed Morgan Estate into a hive of activity. Agent Daniel Roberts, late investigator from the Art Crime Division, turned out to be younger than Rachel expected, mid-30s, with sharp eyes and a measured tone that commanded attention without raising volume. His team moved through the vault with practiced efficiency, photographing, cataloging, and carefully packing each piece for temporary secure storage. Roberts spent hours interviewing Rachel, Frank, and Martha, meticulously documenting the chain of discovery and the vault's contents. The paintings alone are worth approximately $45 million at current market values, Roberts explained as they watched his team work. But their historical and cultural significance multiplies that many times over. These aren't just masterpieces, they're survivors, witnesses to one of history's darkest chapters. The documents proved equally valuable. Gregory Morgan's detailed records provided irrefutable evidence of the artwork's provenance, who had owned them before the war, how they had come into his protection, and in many cases which families or institutions had legitimate claims to their return. Most surprising were the government files. Gregory had somehow obtained internal memos revealing that certain officials had been prepared to approve dubious ownership claims in exchange for political and economic concessions from former Nazi collaborators who had rebranded themselves as Cold War allies. By evening, the vault was empty, its contents transferred to secure FBI transport vehicles. Roberts assured Rachel that everything would be held in trust while ownership claims were verified. The legitimate Morgan family possessions, 7 paintings Gregory had purchased legally before the war, would be returned to Rachel once the investigation concluded. After the FBI departed, the estate felt eerily quiet. Martha had returned to her home in town with a promise to visit again. Frank insisted on staying overnight, setting up a cot in the butler's pantry near the kitchen where Rachel and Sophie slept. The ancient shotgun resting across his knees spoke volumes about his assessment of their security situation. Rachel couldn't sleep. The knowledge that Maxwell Sinclair was still out there, that he knew about the vault, and had come so close to acquiring its contents through intimidation or worse, left her nerves jangling. What would he do when he discovered the art was gone? Would he simply disappear, or would he seek retribution for the fortune that had slipped through his fingers? The answers came sooner than expected. Just past midnight, Sophie shook Rachel awake, her small face pale in the flashlight's beam. "Mom, there are people outside." Frank was already up, moving silently to the kitchen window. Rachel joined him, peering into the darkness. Moonlight revealed 3 vehicles parked at the tree line, headlights off, engines silent. Dark figures moved across the grounds, approaching the estate from multiple directions. "They're not even trying to hide," Frank whispered, checking the shotgun's action. "That's not good. Means they don't care if we see them coming." Rachel pulled Sophie close. "Should we run?" Frank shook his head. "Too late for that, but I know this castle better than they do." He guided them toward the butler's pantry. "There's a passage behind the wine racks, servants' stairs, leads up to the east wing, then connects to the main house through the attic space. Gregory showed me during renovations." The hidden staircase was narrow and steep, cobwebs hanging from a ceiling, so low Frank had to stoop. Sophie climbed steadily, without complaint, one hand clutching her mother's, the other holding the flashlight. They emerged into a dusty corridor lined with small bedrooms, former servants' quarters in the east wing's 3rd floor. Frank led them to a small door that opened onto a catwalk spanning the attic space connecting to the main house. Below them stretched a vast open area filled with trunks, furniture, and decades of accumulated storage. From this vantage point, they could hear movement in the main house, the front door splintering, heavy footsteps in the entrance hall, voices calling to each other as the intruders spread throughout the ground floor. Frank positioned them behind a stack of steamer trunks overlooking the attic access point. "If they follow our trail to the servants' stairs, they'll come through that door. We can circle around behind them through the north gallery." A crash echoed from below, followed by angry shouting. They found the empty vault. Rachel pulled Sophie closer, feeling her daughter tremble. "What do they want now?" "The art is gone." Frank's expression hardened in the dim light. "Information. Payback." Rachel could see the soldier in him, emerging, calculating angles, planning contingencies. "I need you both to stay hidden. I'm going to lead them away from you." Before Rachel could protest, a familiar voice echoed up the stairwell. Maxwell Sinclair, his cultured tones carrying easily in the cavernous space. "Ms. Morgan, I know you're still here. My associates have confirmed your vehicle remains parked outside. Let's discuss this situation like reasonable people." Frank tensed, signaling Rachel and Sophie to remain silent and hidden. Sinclair continued, his voice growing closer. "The art belongs to my clients, Ms. Morgan. They have documentation proving ownership. Your great-grandfather stole their cultural heritage. We simply want to return it to the rightful owners." Rachel bit back a retort, remembering Martha's words about vultures and collaborators. Footsteps on the servants' stairs now. A beam of light swept across the attic space. Frank squeezed Rachel's shoulder once, then slipped away, circling silently behind the storage trunks toward the main staircase. 2 men emerged into the attic, not Sinclair, but clearly his employees, wearing dark tactical clothing and carrying flashlights and pistols. They moved with professional precision, sweeping their lights methodically across the space. Rachel pressed Sophie against the wall behind the trunks, breathing as shallowly as possible. The footsteps came closer, light beams dancing just feet away. Then a tremendous crash from the far side of the attic. Frank had pushed over a stack of furniture, creating a diversion. The men immediately turned, moving toward the sound, calling to others below. Frank was already gone, racing along the catwalk toward the main house. The men followed their shouts, bringing others up from below. Rachel waited until the footsteps faded, then pulled Sophie toward the servants' stairs. They descended as quickly as silence allowed, emerging into the butler's pantry just as voices echoed from the kitchen. 2 more of Sinclair's men entered the pantry. Rachel pushed Sophie behind her, frantically looking for an escape route, finding none. The tallest intruder raised his flashlight, illuminating them against the wall. "Well, well, Mrs. Morgan and the kid. Boss will be pleased." A sharp crack split the air, followed by a second. Both men crumpled to the floor. Frank stood in the doorway, shotgun raised, face grim in the flashlight beam. "Rock salt loads," he explained, already moving to secure the men's weapons. "Painful, but won't kill them. But they'll think twice before coming after a family again." His military background showed in the efficient way he zip-tied the stunned men's hands. More shouts from the front of the house. Frank guided Rachel and Sophie through the kitchen to a narrow door leading to the cellar. We need to get to the tunnel. The cellar tunnel had been part of the original Scottish castle reconstructed along with everything else when Gregory Morgan transported the structure to American soil. Originally designed as an escape route during medieval sieges, it stretched nearly a quarter-mile, emerging in a small stone structure disguised as a groundskeeper's shed. They were halfway through the tunnel when gunshots echoed behind them, bullets ricocheting off stone walls. Frank pushed them forward, occasionally turning to fire the shotgun more to slow their pursuers than to hit anyone in the darkness. The tunnel exit was blocked by a rusted iron gate. Frank struggled with the ancient mechanism, decades of disuse, making it resistant to his efforts. Behind them, flashlight beams bounced off tunnel walls as their pursuers closed the distance. Sophie squeezed past the adults, her small hands reaching through the bars to manipulate the lock from the other side. It's like the puzzle box Zach showed me. You have to press here and here at the same time. The gate swung open with a protesting screech of metal. They stumbled into the night air, the small stone shed offering momentary cover. Frank led them into the forest, moving away from the lights of the main estate. They'd gone perhaps 50 yards when headlights suddenly blazed ahead, momentarily blinding them. Rachel pulled Sophie behind a tree, heart pounding. A familiar voice called out, "Ms. Morgan, Agent Roberts, FBI, are you all right?" The cavalry had arrived. Roberts and a tactical team surrounding the property, alerted by silent alarms the FBI had installed after removing the artwork. Within minutes, Sinclair and his men were in custody, their vehicles blockaded on the estate's driveway. Roberts led Rachel, Sophie, and Frank to the command vehicle, where they provided preliminary statements. Sinclair and his associates would face multiple federal charges: breaking and entering, attempted robbery, assault with deadly weapons, and various art crime statutes. Most significant was Roberts' explanation of Sinclair's real identity and motivation. His real name is Maxwell Schaefer. His grandfather was Heinrich Schaefer, a banker who collaborated with Nazi officials, helping them liquidate assets seized from Jewish families. After the war, he reinvented himself as a respected financier, building a legitimate business empire on the foundation of stolen wealth. The documents we found in Gregory Morgan's vault have already helped us connect Schaefer's family to specific artworks that disappeared during the war. This evidence will support international repatriation efforts beyond just the pieces we recovered here. Dawn broke as Rachel stood on the estate's front steps, watching FBI agents processing the scene. Sophie had finally fallen asleep in the back of Robert's car, exhausted by the night's events. Frank sat nearby, receiving medical attention for a graze wound he hadn't bothered to mention during their escape. The magnitude of what they'd experienced, what they'd helped bring to light, was still sinking in. Not just the recovery of priceless art, but the exposure of decades of deception and the possibility of justice for families who had lost everything. Agent Roberts approached with a satellite phone. "There's someone who'd like to speak with you. A woman from Paris, Esther Bergman. She believes her grandfather's paintings were among those recovered." The elderly woman's voice crackled with emotion as Rachel identified herself. "My grandfather's watercolors of the Seine, are they really safe? We thought them lost forever when the Germans came." Rachel confirmed what Roberts had told her. 3 delicate watercolors carefully preserved in the vault, their provenance meticulously documented by Gregory Morgan. "When he took them for safekeeping, my grandfather said we would see them again when the madness ended. But he did not survive, and neither did my parents. I am the last." Esther's voice broke slightly. "Your great-grandfather kept his promise across time, across death itself." In the days that followed, Morgan Estate transformed into a hub of international activity. Art experts, government officials, and representatives from museums and Jewish heritage organizations arrived to assist with the complex process of determining rightful ownership for each recovered piece. Rachel and Sophie temporarily relocated to the Millbrook Inn, their rooms paid for by the FBI, as the estate became an active crime scene and research center. Frank, recognized as a key figure in protecting both the Morgans and the artwork, received commendations from federal officials that he accepted with uncomfortable grace. Dr. Jenkins and Martha Klausner became invaluable resources, their combined knowledge of local history and the wartime art protection efforts providing context that official records lacked. Martha recognized several pieces, immediately recalling the families who had entrusted them to Gregory Morgan's care. The media descended upon Millbrook, transforming the sleepy town into a temporary press camp. Rachel declined most interview requests, uncomfortable with the sudden attention and protective of Sophie. The narrative emerged nonetheless. Single mother inherits forgotten castle, discovers lost Nazi loot, helps bring justice to Holocaust victims' families. Headlines worldwide proclaimed the discovery, Wobuwutu art cache found in New Hampshire castle, and Morgan's Folly yields $45 million in Nazi-looted art. Rachel watched the coverage with mixed emotions, proud of her great-grandfather's integrity, but troubled by the simplified narratives that ignored the complex moral choices and personal risks he had faced. 2 weeks after the discovery, Rachel sat in Harrison's Manhattan office reviewing legal documents. The 7 paintings legally owned by the Morgan family had been appraised at approximately $6 million. Additionally, several governments and insurance companies were offering substantial finder's fees and rewards for the recovery of the other artworks. Harrison adjusted his glasses, sliding another document across the desk. The French government is particularly grateful. 3 of their national treasures were among the recovered works. They're offering a special compensation package, approximately $2 million after taxes. The final tally was staggering, nearly $5 million in various rewards, fees, and compensations, plus ownership of the 7 family paintings worth $6 million. Enough to restore Morgan estate properly and establish Sophie's college fund with plenty to spare. But the money felt secondary to Rachel. The estate itself, once a burden, had become precious, not for its dollar value, but for its place in history and in her family's legacy. Upon returning to Millbrook, Rachel found Frank supervising temporary repairs to the damage caused during Sinclair's invasion. The FBI had released the property back to her custody, though the vault remained sealed as evidence. Frank had assembled a small crew of local contractors, men and women from town, who had initially scoffed at Rachel's presence but now greeted her with newfound respect. The story of the Morgan estate had transformed her status from eccentric outsider to custodian of Millbrook's most significant historical site. That evening, Dr. Jenkins arrived with architectural plans from the town archives, Gregory Morgan's original restoration blueprints, and subsequent modifications to the estate. The documents would prove invaluable for proper historical restoration. Martha joined them for dinner, bringing her famous stew and more stories of the estate during wartime. Each tale revealed more about Gregory Morgan, his principled stubbornness, his tactical intelligence, his unwavering commitment to preserving culture others sought to destroy. He knew the risks, Martha explained as they sat before the kitchen fireplace. The government officials, the desperate families, the opportunists circling like vultures, they all underestimated him. She smiled, the firelight deepening the lines in her face. He was playing a longer game than any of them understood. Sophie, who had been unusually quiet all evening, suddenly looked up from her sketchbook. Like chess, he sacrificed himself to protect the king. The adults fell silent, struck by the child's insight. Martha nodded slowly, eyes bright with unshed tears. Yes, exactly like that. He knew they would come for him eventually, but he believed someone would finish what he started. She reached across the table to squeeze Rachel's hand, and he was right. Later that night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Rachel stood in the entrance hall, surveying the damage from Sinclair's break-in. The splintered front door had been temporarily secured, but it would need complete replacement. One of the carved banisters on the grand staircase had been broken during the fight. Bullet holes pockmarked the walls in several places. Yet despite the new damage layered atop decades of neglect, Rachel felt a fierce pride in the estate. These walls had protected priceless art through a world war. They had kept secrets for 70 years. They had withstood Sinclair's assault, and they remained standing, ready for restoration, ready for new life. Frank found her there, gazing up at the carved ceiling, roses barely visible in the dim light. Hell of a thing getting shot at in your own home, he observed, coming to stand beside her. Most people would be looking to sell after something like that. Rachel surprised herself with a laugh. I'm not most people, and this isn't most homes, it's us and us. Frank nodded, understanding in his weathered face. What will you do now? With the money, I mean. Restore it. Properly historically accurate. Make it a home again for Sophie and me. But also something more. Rachel had been considering the idea since speaking with Esther Bergman. Maybe a small museum, educational center, somewhere people can learn about Operation Safeguard, about the families who lost everything, about those who worked to preserve what could be saved. Gregory would approve. Frank's voice held rare emotion. He built this place stone by stone to last centuries, not just as shelter, but as a fortress for what matters: beauty, history, truth. Agent Roberts returned the following day with unexpected news. While processing Sinclair, Schaefer, and his associates, the FBI had uncovered connections to an international network of art traffickers specializing in Nazi-looted works. The evidence from Morgan Estate had provided the key to unraveling decades of illegal transactions. More significantly for Rachel, Roberts brought information about her uncle Edward's death, which now appeared less natural than officially recorded. Preliminary investigations suggest Edward Morgan may have been murdered, Roberts explained, as they walked the estate grounds. After purchasing the property in the 1980s, he hired researchers to investigate rumors about hidden art. That caught the attention of Schaefer's organization. Edward died before he could locate the vault, but his death appears suspicious in retrospect. The revelation cast new light on Edward's decision to leave the estate specifically to Rachel. Perhaps he had recognized something in his estranged niece, the same stubbornness, the same moral clarity that had defined Gregory Morgan. Perhaps he'd hoped that what he couldn't accomplish, she might. As spring arrived, Morgan Estate gradually transformed. The immediate repairs gave way to proper restoration work, with Frank overseeing a growing team of contractors, many specializing in historical preservation. Sophie thrived in her new school, her initial notoriety as the castle girl evolving into genuine friendships and academic recognition. Rachel's relationship with Dr. Jenkins deepened into true collaboration as they established the Morgan Foundation for Art Repatriation, using a portion of the reward money to fund research and legal assistance for families still seeking lost heirlooms. Martha Klausner became the Foundation's first oral historian, recording her memories of Operation Safeguard for future generations. The vault itself was restored and repurposed as a secure research room where scholars could study Gregory Morgan's extensive documentation by appointment. The rest of the estate gradually came back to life, roof-repaired windows, replaced gardens, reclaimed from wilderness. As work progressed, Rachel often found herself standing in the entrance hall at dawn, watching sunlight illuminate the restored wooden panels and freshly cleaned stone carvings. In those quiet moments, she could almost feel the weight of history, not as burden, but as foundation, something solid upon which to build a future worthy of those who had come before. What had begun as an inheritance she never wanted had become a mission she couldn't imagine abandoning. Morgan Estate wasn't just a home or a historical curiosity, it was living testimony to one man's refusal to surrender beauty and truth to those who would destroy both. On the morning Rachel signed the final paperwork establishing Morgan Estate as both a private residence and a limited-access historical site, Frank presented her with a gift, a framed black-and-white photograph he'd discovered in town archives. It showed Gregory Morgan standing before the partially reconstructed castle in 927, sleeves rolled up, tools in hand, determination etched in features Rachel recognized from family portraits and more recently her own mirror. Not all treasures are made of paint and canvas, Frank observed as Rachel studied the image. Some are built of stone and sacrifice. Some are written in blood and bone. The compass rose onto brass keys seemed to warm in Rachel's pocket as she nodded, understanding completely. Legacy wasn't just what you inherited, it was what you chose to defend, what you committed to preserve for those who would come after. September sunlight poured through the newly restored stained glass windows of Morgan Estate's East Wing, casting jewel-toned patterns across the wooden floors. 6 weeks had passed since the FBI raid and Sinclair's arrest. The estate buzzed with the sounds of skilled craftsmen, hammers tapping against stone saws cutting replacement beams, sanders smoothing rough edges of woodwork that hadn't been touched in decades. Rachel stood in what would become the Morgan Foundation's research library, reviewing architectural plans with a structural engineer. They were discussing the feasibility of reinforcing the ceiling without compromising its original ornate plasterwork when Frank appeared in the doorway. "That's going to be tricky, but I know a specialist in Boston who restored similar work at the Gardner Museum." Frank nodded toward the ceiling medallion, his practical mind already solving the problem. "The trick is supporting the structure from above while working on it from below. We'll need to access the crawl space and install temporary bracing." The engineer nodded appreciatively. Most contractors would simply tear it out and start fresh. The preservation approach requires more skill, but the results are worth it. Frank had evolved from occasional helper to project manager, his military precision and deep knowledge of the estate making him invaluable. His crew now numbered 15 masons, carpenters, electricians, and plumbers, many descended from the same craftsmen who had reassembled the castle under Gregory Morgan's direction nearly a century earlier. After the engineer left, Frank lingered, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "There's something you should see in the West Tower. We've uncovered something while removing damaged plaster." The West Tower had sustained significant water damage over the decades, requiring extensive restoration. As they climbed the spiral staircase, Frank explained that his team had discovered unusual patterning beneath the deteriorated wall coverings. The uppermost room was bright with afternoon light scaffolding erected against its circular walls. A section of plaster had been carefully removed, revealing what lay beneath: frescoes. Rachel breathed, reaching out, but stopping short of touching the vibrant colors. Beneath decades of wallpaper and plaster, delicate paintings emerged: celestial maps with gold-leaf stars, their colors remarkably preserved where they hadn't been exposed to light or moisture. "The whole room might be like this," Frank said. Gregory Morgan apparently commissioned an Italian artist to paint the tower interior before covering it over during the war, possibly to protect it from government requisition. "The conservator I called thinks these may be valuable in their own right." Rachel stepped back, taking in the star charts that seemed to glow from within the plaster. "It's another layer of treasure hidden in plain sight." Frank's weathered face creased with a rare smile. "That seems to be a pattern with this place." The discovery energized the restoration team. If such beauty lay hidden beneath damaged surfaces, what else might the estate reveal? Each wall, each floor, each ceiling became a potential canvas concealing history. The work took on new significance, not merely repair, but excavation archaeology of a family legacy. The practical challenges were daunting. The slate roof alone required specialized craftsmen from Vermont who understood traditional techniques. The plumbing system resembled a museum exhibit of evolving technologies: copper pipes from the 1920s connected to lead from the 1940s, intersecting with PVC from the 1980s. The electrical system was a fire hazard of knob and tube wiring, spliced haphazardly into more modern circuits. Frank approached each challenge methodically, teaching Rachel the intricacies of the estate's systems as they worked. "Knowledge is ownership," he told her while showing how to reset the ancient boiler. "If you understand how your home works, you'll never be at the mercy of others to maintain it." Rachel proved an apt pupil, her confidence growing with each skill mastered. The woman who once apologized for taking up space now confidently directed construction crews, made decisions about materials costing thousands of dollars, and negotiated with vendors and contractors. While the adults focused on restoration, Sophie struggled with the aftermath of that terrifying night. The initial excitement of their narrow escape had faded, replaced by nightmares and a new wariness. She checked locks compulsively, started at unexpected noises, and refused to enter certain rooms alone, particularly the tunnels where bullets had ricocheted off stone walls during their flight. Dr. Jenkins suggested a child psychologist who specialized in trauma, but Sophie resisted, insisting she was fine. It was Martha Klausner who finally broke through, sharing her own experiences of fear and flight during the war. "I was not much older than you when I first came to America, to this very house," Martha told Sophie one afternoon as they baked cookies in the kitchen. "I had nightmares too, dreams of men in black coats coming to take us away, of running through streets that turned into mazes with no exit." "What helped you?" Sophie asked, her guard lowered by Martha's matter-of-fact tone. "First, I learned where all the exits were." Martha handed Sophie a rolling pin. "Gregory Morgan showed me every door, every window, every passage in this house. Knowledge is power, especially when you are afraid." "Second, I learned to defend myself, just small things, but enough to feel less helpless." Frank, overhearing this conversation, offered to teach Sophie basic self-defense. The lessons became a daily ritual, simple techniques adapted for a child's strength and size, focusing more on awareness and escape than confrontation. Sophie approached the training with unexpected seriousness, practicing blocking movements and breakaway techniques with focused determination. Most importantly, Martha added, "One evening, after a particularly effective practice session, I learned that fear is not weakness. It is information. It tells us to be cautious, but not paralyzed. The brave are not those who feel no fear, but those who act despite it." The simple wisdom resonated with Sophie. Gradually, the nightmares decreased. She began exploring the estate again, though now with a small notebook documenting exit routes and hiding places, knowledge as armor against uncertainty. In October, Rachel received notice that Sinclair's trial date had been set. The charges were substantial: breaking and entering attempted kidnapping, assault with deadly weapons, illegal firearms possession, conspiracy to traffic stolen artwork, and most seriously, conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Edward Morgan. Agent Roberts visited to prepare Rachel for her testimony, bringing case files and evidence documentation. I should warn you, the defense will try to undermine your credibility. They'll suggest you manipulated the situation to your financial advantage, perhaps even planted the artwork yourself. Rachel nodded unsurprised. And the murder charge, we've turned Sinclair's right-hand man. Roberts spread photographs across the table, surveillance images of Edward Morgan from 2023, followed by autopsy photos. The pattern matched other victims in suspected art trafficking cases made to look like natural causes, but actually a sophisticated poison that mimics heart failure. Nearly undetectable unless you're specifically looking for it. The trial would be held in federal court in Boston, expected to last several weeks. Rachel worried about leaving the estate, and Sophie during this critical phase of restoration, but Frank immediately offered a solution. Sophie can stay with me at my cabin during the trial. It's close enough for her to continue school, and I can shift the restoration schedule to focus on exterior work that doesn't require your daily input. His matter-of-fact tone masked what they both recognized as a significant step in their evolving relationship. The trial began in early November, attracting international media attention. Nazi loot trial opens blared the headlines, with Rachel's photograph often featured prominently despite her attempts to maintain privacy. The courthouse steps became a daily gauntlet of reporters shouting questions. Inside, the process unfolded with methodical precision: opening statements, evidence presentations, expert testimony on art provenance and authentication. Rachel testified for 3 days, describing the discovery of the vault, the documentation inside, and Sinclair's escalating threats. Defense attorneys attempted to portray her as an opportunistic fortune hunter who had manipulated her way into an inheritance and fabricated threats to gain sympathy and financial rewards. The most difficult moment came during cross-examination, when Sinclair's lawyer suggested Rachel had known about the artwork all along, possibly from Edward Morgan himself. "Isn't it convenient, Mrs. Morgan, that you, an estranged relative with no previous contact with your uncle, suddenly inherited exactly the property containing a multi-million-dollar art collection? Isn't it possible you and Edward Morgan conspired to hide these works from legitimate claimants?" Rachel gripped the witness stand, anger rising. "My uncle was murdered by your client's associates for trying to do what I eventually did: uncover the truth and return these artworks to their rightful owners. If I'd been part of some conspiracy, why would I immediately call the FBI instead of quietly selling the paintings? Why establish a foundation dedicated to returning these works rather than claiming them for myself?" The defense attorney had no effective response, and Rachel's righteous indignation resonated with the jury. On the trial's 10th day, Maxwell Sinclair himself took the stand, a shadow of his formerly imposing self in prison-issued clothing. His testimony revealed the full extent of the network. He represented wealthy collectors who specialized in acquiring art with questionable provenance, particularly pieces that had disappeared during World War II. Sinclair's facade of refinement crumbled under prosecution questioning. When confronted with evidence linking his grandfather Heinrich Schaefer to Nazi art confiscation, he exploded in anger. "Those paintings were legally acquired. My grandfather provided financial services during a chaotic time. These so-called victims abandoned their property when they fled. We simply preserved what would otherwise have been destroyed." His outburst horrified the courtroom, revealing the callous rationalization behind decades of profiting from tragedy. During a recess, Martha Klausner, who had traveled to Boston to attend the proceedings, shook her head sadly. "I have heard these same words for 70 years, from the guards who took our home, from the officials who seized our business, from the neighbors who moved into our houses. You left it behind, so it became ours, as if we had any choice but to run or die." The jury deliberated for just 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The judge, citing the historical significance of the crimes and their connection to Holocaust-era theft, sentenced Sinclair to the maximum 15 years in federal prison, forfeiture of assets, and restitution payments to identified victims. As Sinclair was led away, he locked eyes with Rachel. "I was just the front man," he said coldly. "There are others who will continue this work. Some treasures belong to those with the power to protect them." Rachel didn't flinch. "That's where you're wrong. They belong to their rightful owners. Always have, always will." Outside the courthouse, Martha faced the media beside Rachel. Speaking 6 languages fluidly, she addressed international outlets with personal testimony about the artworks rescued by Gregory Morgan and the families who had entrusted their cultural treasures to him during humanity's darkest hour. "This verdict is not about money or property," Martha told the cameras. "It is about acknowledging theft for what it is, even when draped in legal language. It is about recognizing that objects removed under threat of death are not abandoned, they are stolen." When Rachel returned to Morgan Estate after the trial, she found the renovation had progressed remarkably under Frank's supervision. The roof was completely restored, the electrical system modernized while preserving original fixtures, and the plumbing replaced with materials that would last another century. Most surprisingly, Frank and Sophie had transformed the East Wing's ground floor into the future headquarters of the Morgan Foundation, creating research spaces and a small gallery for rotating exhibits. Sophie had supervised the installation of track lighting with a professional's eye for detail, insisting on specific angles to highlight wall textures and display areas. Frank downplayed his accomplishments with characteristic modesty. "We had good weather and skilled crews. Plus, your daughter is a remarkably effective taskmaster. She has Gregory's eye for detail and your determination." That evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, Rachel and Frank sat before the library fireplace, sharing a bottle of wine, a ritual they had developed before the trial, but which now carried deeper significance after weeks apart. "Thank you for keeping everything going, for taking care of Sophie." Rachel's voice carried more than professional gratitude. Frank studied the firelight through his glass. "She's a remarkable kid. Made my old cabin feel like a home again." He hesitated, then continued, "I've been alone a long time. Military, then civilian, contracting overseas. Never stayed in one place long enough for attachments. Never saw the point." Rachel waited, recognizing the effort these personal disclosures required from a man accustomed to self-containment. "This place, you two, it's the first time in decades I've felt," Frank searched for the word, "anchored. Like I'm building something that matters beyond the next paycheck." In the gentle silence that followed, Rachel moved closer, their shoulders touching. When she finally spoke, her words were simple but carried the weight of deliberate choice. "We're not going anywhere, neither are you." His weathered hand found her fingers interlacing without need for further words. The fire crackled, casting their shadows against the restored bookshelves of Morgan Estate, new patterns forming from ancient light. December brought heavy snow, transforming the estate into a winter postcard, stone walls capped with white gardens, buried under pristine drifts, icicles hanging from gargoyle mouths like crystal beards. Inside, modern heating fought successfully against drafts that had once whistled through broken windows and cracked walls. The Morgan Foundation officially launched with a modest ceremony attended by state officials, representatives from international cultural organizations, and families connected to the recovered artworks. Dr. Jenkins served as executive director, bringing academic rigor and institutional connections. Martha headed the Historical Documentation Initiative, recording testimonials from survivors and their descendants. Rachel positioned the foundation as independent from both government agencies and major museums, a neutral intermediary focused solely on reconnecting looted art with rightful owners. This stance occasionally created tension with larger institutions that preferred handling such matters internally but earned respect from families who had struggled for decades against bureaucratic stonewalling. The foundation's most powerful tool emerged from an unexpected source. During trial preparation, FBI technicians had digitized all documents from Gregory Morgan's vault. Agent Roberts shared this database with Rachel, who worked with computer specialists to develop a searchable system connecting artwork provenance with transportation records, government requisitions, and post-war claims. This digital archive revealed patterns invisible when examining cases individually. Certain dealers appeared repeatedly as intermediaries for looted art entering American collections. Specific shipping companies specialized in transporting art with questionable provenance. Museum acquisition committees sometimes included members with direct connections to Nazi-affiliated European banks. When the database launched publicly in January, It created shockwaves through the art world. The foundation identified over 200 works in American collections with clear evidence of looting forced sales or questionable post-war acquisition, including pieces by Matisse, Picasso, Monet, and Renoir. Museums responded predictably. Larger institutions with powerful boards issued carefully worded statements promising to review the research and follow established protocols for provenance concerns. Smaller museums lacking such legal and financial resources often engage more directly with the Foundation's findings. The National Gallery in Washington became an unexpected ally when its director, a Jewish woman whose own family had lost a significant collection during the Holocaust, announced a comprehensive review of all European acquisitions made between 1945 and 1960. Her public statement acknowledged that established protocols had sometimes prioritized institutional interests over ethical considerations. In February, Rachel received an invitation to speak at a congressional hearing on art repatriation legislation. Though public speaking terrified her, she recognized the importance of adding her voice to the policy conversation. The hearing room fell silent as Rachel described how powerful institutions had constructed elaborate justifications for retaining artworks with questionable histories. These aren't just beautiful objects on museum walls. They're family heirlooms torn from homes during history's darkest moments. They're cultural treasures stolen from communities that were then systematically destroyed. When we treat them merely as aesthetic or financial assets, we become complicit in the original theft. The resulting legislation established stronger standards for provenance research and created legal pathways for claimants seeking the return of Nazi-looted art. The Morgan Foundation was named to an advisory committee overseeing implementation of the new guidelines. As winter yielded to early spring, the estate grounds emerged from snow to reveal gardens long neglected but still structurally intact. Rachel hired a landscape historian to guide restoration of Gregory Morgan's original design, formal gardens near the house transitioning to more naturalistic plantings that blended into the surrounding forest. Sophie threw herself into this aspect of restoration with characteristic enthusiasm, spending hours with the landscape team learning about historical plantings and maintenance techniques. Her interest in the estate's grounds mirrored her earlier fascination with its architecture, comprehensive, detailed, somehow personal. Frank observed her one afternoon as she confidently directed workers on the placement of heritage roses, her small figure gesturing with authority far beyond her years. "Sometimes I forget she's only 9, he commented to Rachel. "Way she talks about this place, you'd think she helped build it the first time around." The observation lingered with Rachel, adding to her collection of small mysteries surrounding her daughter's connection to Morgan Estate. Sophie's knowledge extended beyond what she could have learned from books or overheard conversations. She knew where underground pipes ran before excavation confirmed their locations. She anticipated structural issues in walls before engineers discovered them. She sometimes hummed melodies on the restored grand piano that Martha recognized from evening concerts during the war years. Dr. Jenkins suggested having Sophie work with a child psychologist who specialized in gifted children and unusual cognitive patterns. The sessions revealed nothing concerning Sophie was emotionally healthy, intellectually advanced, and socially well-adjusted. Her unique connection to Morgan Estate fell into what the psychologist termed statistically improbable but not clinically significant phenomena. In April, during restoration of the small stone structure that concealed the tunnel entrance, workers removing ivy from the walls uncovered a carved stone panel hidden by decades of growth, the Morgan family crest surrounded by symbols similar to those on the brass key that had unlocked the vault. Frank recognized the pattern, immediately calling Rachel to examine the weathered carvings. Similar design to the vault lock, but different. Another puzzle. Rachel contacted Harrison, who arranged for examination of Edward's remaining personal effects. Among them was a small leather pouch containing what appeared to be ancient coins, Roman, according to the appraiser's report dating from the 1st century CE. Edward's journals made no mention of the coins, but Martha recognized them immediately. Gregory collected ancient currencies, fascinated by the way they combined art history and commerce in portable form. These specific coins had been displayed in a cabinet in his study before the government requisitioned the estate. Rachel brought the coins to the stone structure, studying the carved panel with new understanding. The depressions in the stone matched the dimensions of the Roman coins precisely. When placed in the correct arrangement, guided by the compass rose pattern, a section of the stone wall swung inward, revealing a small chamber. Inside was a metal document box, its lock matching the smaller key hidden within the brass key that had opened the vault. The contents were simple but profound. Gregory Morgan's personal journal sealed in protective material, a letter addressed to the finder, and a single canvas wrapped in archival fabric. The letter, dated 3 days before Gregory's death in 1947, explained everything. To whoever finds this, I trust it will be family, though perhaps generations hence. The art in the vault represents my life's work, protecting cultural treasures from those who would destroy or exploit them. Most pieces have rightful owners who may yet be found, but this one work is different. It is my own creation, painted the year I began transporting this castle across the ocean. It holds no monetary value, but perhaps some sentimental worth to those who share my blood and my purpose. If you have found this chamber, you have already demonstrated the perseverance and insight I hoped would endure in the Morgan line. May this castle stand another 5 centuries, and may it always shelter those who value beauty and truth above temporary power. The canvas, when carefully unwrapped, revealed an amateur's landscape painting of Morgan Estate as it had appeared in the 1920s, newly reconstructed and not yet embraced by ivy and moss. At the bottom, in careful script, "For the Morgan who finds this, you were worth waiting for." Rachel had the painting professionally conserved and hung in the library where morning light would always find it. Unlike the masterpieces that had passed through the vault, Gregory's modest artwork held value beyond any auction estimate, a direct connection between past and present, a message sent across decades with faith that it would someday be received. By May, the Foundation's work had facilitated the return of 23 artworks to families or institutions with legitimate claims. Each return brought not just media coverage, but profound human moments. Elderly survivors touching canvases they had last seen as children. Museum directors welcoming back pieces thought destroyed during bombing raids. Grandchildren seeing for the first time the paintings their ancestors had described in family stories. The most moving reunion involved Esther Bergman, who traveled from Paris to Boston to receive 3 watercolors painted by her grandfather, delicate Paris street scenes that had been wedding gifts to her parents. The only surviving pieces of a family collection, once numbering over 50 works. Rachel accompanied Esther to the secure facility where the paintings were stored, pending final authentication and release. The elderly woman's hands trembled slightly as the curator carefully unveiled the first watercolor, the Seine at dawn fog rising from the water, Notre Dame's silhouette emerging from morning mist. "To see these again," Esther whispered, her fingers hovering inches above the protected surface. "It is like hearing my grandfather's voice after 80 years of silence." That evening back at Morgan Estate, Esther shared photographs of her grandfather's studio in Montmartre and stories of her family's life before the occupation. During her week-long stay, she developed a special bond with Sophie, recognizing in the child's artistic sensitivity echoes of her own childhood, before war had shattered its normalcy. Before departing, Esther presented Sophie with a small watercolor set that had belonged to her grandfather. Brushes with ivory handles worn smooth by decades of use, pigments in tiny porcelain cups, all contained in a weathered leather case. "He would want another artist to use these," she told the wide-eyed child. "Art outlives us all. It is how we speak to the future." June brought the official designation of Morgan Estate as a National Historic Landmark, recognizing its significance in American architectural history and its role in preserving cultural heritage during World War II. The designation brought additional protections and made the estate eligible for preservation grants, ensuring its maintenance beyond Rachel's lifetime. The ceremony attracted national media and government officials, including the director of the National Gallery and representatives from the State Department's Cultural Affairs Division. Rachel accepted the designation plaque with characteristic modesty, redirecting attention to the broader significance of Operation Safeguard and the ongoing work of repatriation. As the first anniversary of Rachel and Sophie's arrival at Morgan Estate approached, Sophie announced she wanted a birthday party, not just any celebration, but one that included everyone who helped save the castle. On what had begun as a children's birthday party evolved into something more symbolic, a community celebration of Morgan Estate's resurrection and its new role in Millbrook. Tables laden with food stretched along one wall of the Grand Hall, now restored to its original glory. Children played elaborate games of hide-and-seek throughout the public areas of the estate. Adults gathered in conversational clusters, many seeing the fully restored interior for the first time. Frank had outdone himself with Sophie's gift, a custom-built treehouse constructed in an ancient oak near the lake, designed as a miniature version of the estate itself, complete with tiny towers and dormer windows. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the structure sound enough to last decades. Dr. Jenkins contributed a leather-bound collection of books on architecture and art history, selected to challenge Sophie's advanced reading level while nurturing her specific interests. Martha presented a handmade quilt incorporating fabric scraps from the estate's original curtains and upholstery preserved during the restoration. Rachel's gift was more intangible, permission for Sophie to establish a children's architectural workshop at the estate where local kids could learn basic design and construction principles through hands-on projects. The program would become part of the foundation's educational outreach, with Sophie serving as junior instructor alongside professional architects and builders. As evening approached, Frank surprised everyone by setting up an outdoor projector. On the stone wall of the estate, he displayed a digitized home movie from the 1930s, footage of Gregory Morgan supervising construction of the East Wing, discovered in a town resident's attic during spring cleaning. The grainy black and white images brought Gregory to life in a way photographs had not. His purposeful stride as he inspected stonework, his animated conversations with craftsmen, his occasional glances toward the camera with what seemed like amused tolerance for the recording process. Rachel watched transfixed as her great-grandfather moved through scenes of construction that mirrored the restoration she had overseen nearly a century later. The family resemblance was striking, not just physical features, but mannerisms, the tilt of the head when considering a problem, the way he used his hands when explaining a concept to workers. Sophie sat forward in her chair, eyes never leaving the projected images. "I knew he looked like that," she whispered, barely audible. "I remember." The comment might have been dismissed as a child's imagination, except that the footage had been discovered only days earlier, and Sophie had never seen photographs of Gregory from this period of his life. The moment passed without further explanation, adding another thread to the tapestry of inexplicable connections between Sophie and the estate's history. That night, after the guests had departed and Sophie had fallen asleep, Rachel and Frank stood on the observation platform atop the North Tower. From this vantage point, they could see the entire property, formal gardens transitioning to wilder plantings, the lake reflecting moonlight forests stretching toward distant mountains. "First time I saw this place, it was falling apart." Frank reflected his arm around Rachel's shoulders. Roof-leaking windows, broken trees growing through the floors in some spots. "Thought Edward was crazy for buying it, even crazier, for keeping it all those years without living in it." Rachel leaned into his solid presence, a steadiness she had come to rely on. "And now I understand what he saw. What Gregory saw when he brought it across an ocean stone by stone." Frank gestured toward the illuminated windows below, each representing a room reclaimed, a space reborn. "Some places aren't just buildings. They're anchors for what matters. Memory, beauty, truth, things that last beyond one lifetime." Their relationship had evolved gradually over the months of restoration, professional respect, deepening into friendship, and then something more profound. Both carried histories that made them cautious about romantic entanglements, but in moments like this, standing shoulder to shoulder atop the tower they had rebuilt together, words seemed unnecessary. Frank turned to face her, the moonlight silvering his white hair. "Rachel Morgan, there's something I've been wanting to ask you." His voice carried the gravel of age and emotion. "I'm not good with fancy words, but I know what I feel. This past year, working alongside you, watching you fight for what's right, seeing you rebuild not just this place, but a legacy." Rachel placed her fingers gently against his lips. "Yes," she said simply, his weathered face creased with surprise then understanding. "Yes to what exactly? Yes to whatever you're asking. Yes to us. Yes to building something that lasts." Frank's laugh held decades of solitude finally broken. "That's what I love about you, Rachel Morgan. You always see right to the heart of things." Their kiss was gentle, unhurried, two people who had found each other later in life, who understood the value of what they were building together. The following morning, still stood in the entrance hall, watching Sophie depart for school, backpack over one shoulder, lunch bag in hand, conversation flowing easily with Frank, who had taken to driving her each morning before starting the day's restoration work. The tableau struck Rachel with unexpected force. How ordinary it seemed now, this life that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. The struggling single mother with $27 in an eviction notice had transformed into the mistress of a historic estate director of an internationally recognized foundation, guardian of a legacy that stretched back centuries and forward into an unwritten future. The brass key with its compass, rose pattern, sat on her desk upstairs, no longer needed for any lock but kept as a reminder that some doors only open for those with the patience to understand their mechanisms and the courage to step through when they finally yield. Morgan Estate stood solid around her, its stones holding memories of two world wars, economic collapse, personal tragedies, and triumphant recoveries. It had weathered Sinclair's assault government requisition, decades of abandonment, and nature's slow reclamation. Through it all, the estate had endured, waiting perhaps for the right Morgan to come home. Rachel traced her fingers along the carved banister of the grand staircase, feeling the subtle imperfections that marked it as handcrafted rather than machine-produced. The estate was like that, beautiful, not despite its irregularities, but because of them. Perfect in its imperfection, valuable beyond any monetary assessment. Her great-grandfather had understood this truth when he transported an ancient castle across an ocean. Her uncle had honored it when he purchased the neglected estate decades later. Now Rachel continued their work, not just preserving stone walls and carved ceilings, but the principles they represented: beauty worth protecting, history worth remembering, truth worth any price to defend. The morning sunlight streamed through restored stained glass, casting jewel-toned patterns across the entrance hall floor. Rachel stepped into one such pool of colored light, feeling its warmth on her face like a benediction. She who had once been invisible now stood illuminated, casting her own shadow across time. When she'd first arrived at Morgan Estate, Rachel had seen only ruin and responsibility. Now she understood what Gregory and Edward had known, that some inheritances came disguised as burdens, that some treasures required courage to claim, that the most valuable legacies couldn't be measured in dollars or square footage, but in purpose that transcended a single lifetime. The castle stood strong against the spring sky, no longer abandoned and no longer a folly. It was home. And in the gallery where Gregory's amateur landscape hung in simple honor, his words remained as true now as when he had written them nearly a century before. For the Morgan who finds this, you were worth waiting for.